just like Napoleon, short people crave attention. So, no. Well, I've been asked to talk about trade and its centrality. I think that everyone in Britain needs no convincing about that centrality, given the way in which Brexit has been one of the lightning rods of politics and so on. In fact, if the Brexit debate had gone differently, if the left had different alternatives, our comrade John might have been sitting in 11 Downing Street or whatever it is that the Chancellor, wherever it is that the Chancellor lays his head these days. The question of trade, of course, has been central to the way in which, under neoliberalism, the kinds of international economic relations have been restructured. And they have been restructured in a manner that has accentuated the polarization between rich and poor in every part of the world, but also rich and poor between the global north and the global south, and in particular, rich and poor between owners of capital, the employer class, our rulers, and the rest of us. And I think a continent like Africa dramatically underlines some of what has taken place. If you look at the case of Africa, we know that trade liberalization has been the direct cause of the premature end of efforts to industrialize economies away from primary raw material commodity export dependence. We know that the industrialization has been devastating. In 1980, for example, total employment in sub-Saharan Africa, 28% of people were in manufacturing and so on. I'm fully aware of the consequences of an environmentally unfriendly industrialization, but let's take some things for granted so I can make a couple of important points. And that has collapsed to the level of about 4% today. Of course, it's uneven. A country like South Africa will account for most of that average. A country like Niger won't be registering on that scale at all, in all probability, apart from the uranium mines, which the French multinationals and the Americans want to get their hands into as we speak. Industrialization, of course, isn't simply about industry. It speaks to the question of production writ large. And that is why the collapse of industrialization, which also represents the collapse of the ability of one part of economies to supply needs of those in the rural economy, those in agriculture, and so on and so forth, that interaction, the collapse of that interaction has also meant the devastation of agriculture in much of Africa itself. So you have deindustrialization, you have de-agrarianization. These are the realities that we confront today. And what that has wrought is a vast pool of immiseration. Unprecedented, I suppose, in modern times. Yes, the World Bank says that the minimum living wage, ridiculous as it is supposed to be what, $1.90, or has it increased generously to about $2 something? Well, in the case of Africa, a majority, the mean earnings, the daily mean earnings of people in the vast pool of the precarious labor is around 62 pence a day. And the new middle class that the World Bank was celebrating in Africa, its mean earnings would be on the order of about 15 pounds a day. Now, you are here fighting for 15 pounds an hour, which is probably too small anyway, but here we are talking about this. Now, it's important to situate this kind of understanding in what are the mechanisms that enable this to happen. All of us know that the institutions such as the WTO, that the European Union, that the North American Free Trade Agreement, and so on and so forth, those which are being conducted in Asia and the Pacific and so on, are directly the mechanism by which capital enables these processes to be initiated, to be locked in, and to recompose the balance of who gets what, who gets the job, how much you get paid, and so on and so forth. And that is why today, as we speak, many of those who are fighting for alternatives are very much concerned with what we do, for example, when the WTO, the 13th Ministerial of the WTO meets very soon. Debates are going on, critical confrontations going on about how digitalization, for example, mightn't become a new form of global division where these inequalities that I'm talking about become weaponized and accentuated. And of course, at the peril of a sustainable, global, green, and just, equitable, just transition. We also know that many countries in the past have found different ways, have attempted different ways to address this question of trade. So we found that, for example, in the new international economic order that Bhumika and comrade, sorry, what's your name again? Charles, sorry. It was Jason on the thing, so, thought. I thought it was Jason Charles or something. Anyway, we found that governments across the global south began to take measures to ensure that the imbalances in trade were they were able to redress them directly and frontally. But those efforts didn't succeed, and those efforts are part of the preamble to where we are today. All of us who are fighting along the front of free trade, our efforts, I think, are absolutely required, but I don't think that they're adequate. So when we speak about alternatives, John is not in number 11. Neither is any of us. What are the alternatives that you and I can begin to enact? And that's what I'd like to use my last 5 minutes or so to address. The thing about trade, of course, is that it isn't simply about one mechanism. It is the way in which it enables the production system itself to be restructured. So we find, for example, that when we talk about climate finance, or we talk about what the alternatives may be, at the same time that we're lamenting the dearth, the shortage, the outrageous fact that there's no climate finance, whilst there's $250 billion to fight wars in Ukraine and God knows what else for people to decimate and wipe out the entire Palestinian population, we also know that as we speak, there is money sloshing around for other purposes as well. Just this week, Rio Tinto, a British mining company, has approved what it calls the biggest mining investment ever in world history. This is taking place in West Africa, in a country called Guinea. The initial projections are that the investments will be to the order of 20 billion. And of course, Rio Tinto is one of those companies whose annual turnover is bigger than the country that it's operating to start with. Last year, Rio Tinto distributed to its shareholders over 16 billion, almost 17 billion pounds. One of the record levels of shareholder payouts ever. Now, Rio Tinto is a British company, okay? The capacity of you sitting in this room to confront it, to ensure even with the small measures that start from saying that those shareholders who stole that 17 billion from the poor of the world ought to pay capital gains tax, they ought to be dispossessed one way or the other, incrementally and so on, that's a start. But of course, there are other things that can link to. Because Rio Tinto is also dependent not simply on government tax breaks and rigged financial rules and rigged trade rules, it is also dependent on the labor of people, including in the global south itself. So here you are in a situation where, when the Financial Times reported this, there was a small one-line bit in the article where the CEO of Rio Tinto says, of course, everything we do will be community-friendly. It will depend on the approval of communities. We will ensure, adequate and fair labor, conditions and so on and so forth. We know, of course, the man is a thief, he's a liar, he's a murderer. But nonetheless, why does he have to say it? He has to say it because the working people of Guinea will now have the power to scupper what Rio Tinto is about. The Rio Tinto project isn't simply about mining, it's about the type of infrastructure from rail to port that we saw in the colonial period. That means the communities that are affected, those who work on the rails, those who work on the mines, those who work on the at the ports, all can have a conjoint interest, just like you sitting here in London can also impinge upon Rio Tinto. So when we talk about alternatives, concretely, one of the things that ought to concern us, whether we're starting off from the angle, the all-important angle of the needs and requirements of the Global South, is that production capabilities, the ability to produce goods and services, on which terms, for which use, in whose benefit, ordinary working people must come into control of that. That's the first condition. Wherever they are in the world, production takes place, profits take place, and therefore those possibilities exist. The second point, of course, is that when we talk about those production chains and the trade and financial mechanisms that accompany them, they are not linked to any one country, any one locality, any one community. If a community wants a green transformation, if a community in the Sahel, where Guinea is very close to, in fact, parts of Guinea are in the Sahel, wants to ensure that it has new water management systems, it can't possibly regulate that on its own, as simply as a community. Okay, because these flow from rivers, they flow from the sea, you all know the systems that are involved, so it requires it to coordinate its efforts, democratically speaking, with other communities from different ethnicities, different religions, and so on. Nor can we leave those communities intact as they are if they are patriarchal and so on. The rights of women and so on have to take to the fore. Nor can we fail to address the question of ethnicity. So when you are here fighting the question of green transition, and as Bhumika eloquently said, the question of confronting race is central to it. The question of ensuring that identity politics of all kinds do not divide our ranks is central to it. And that centrality, apart from its moral and ethical power, also is one that is rooted in objective conditions of production and trade, as I'm trying to indicate here. So, comrades, let me end. I know time is short. I hope you will get a word in at some point. But let me end by saying this. Ultimately, yes, we have been brutalized, victimized, immiserated. Not everybody. You might look at my tummy and say, who are you talking about? But you know what I mean. But the fact is that we can fight back. And our capacity to fight back, our ultimate orientation on that capacity, and that capacity informing the strategies that we take at every level, every space, and so on, these are the central questions. And I think this point in time, in a system as rapacious as this is, as a system which knows absolutely no limits, the opportunities and the necessity of challenging are manifold, countless, and so on. How we do so, I think, is something that all of us have an opportunity to do, and I hope that when we leave this room, we are armed to do that better, and we are armed to start that tonight, continue tomorrow, until we win the world that all of us deserve. Thank you very much.